Hi, my name is Jacky. I'm a second-year English Language and Literature undergraduate at St. Catherine's College, University of Oxford. I got 52 out of 60 on my English Literature admissions test, otherwise known as the Elat, and today I'm here to talk you through that test as well as give you some pointers and advice. Firstly, I will be discussing the format of the Elat. After that, I will be explaining the scoring of that test, as well as perhaps contextualizing the importance of the Elat within the wider Oxbridge admissions process. Finally, I'll be giving you advice, though instead of giving list after list of advice, which I think will be a bit vague, I'll instead be bringing you through one entire past paper, explaining to you how I would approach that particular paper and the particular texts, so as to give you, I hope, some more stable grounding. If you would then like a summary of all the advice I have given, then please feel free to check out the Elat guide on our website, which should be down in the description below. Format-wise, the Elat is a 90-minute test in which you have to write one essay comparing 2 out of 6 texts that are linked by a common theme. Now there's a lot to break down here. So firstly, you may ask, well, what texts? Well, these texts can come from any literary period, from the 16th to the 21st centuries. They can also be of a variety of different forms, including, for instance, extracts from prose fiction, poems, either complete or, again, extracts, dramatic texts, and they may even be from a number of different forms of nonfiction prose, for instance, radio programs, or memoirs, or autobiographies. Then you may ask, what themes? Well, again, they can be virtually anything. Topics in the past that have come up include love, death, loss, clothing, and even food. Finally, dates. The Elat usually takes place around late October or early November. In the case of the year 2021, it takes place in early November. The sheer variety and complexity of the texts you will encounter in the Elat then gives us also a good clue as to how it matters in the admissions process. I would say that the Elat offers students the opportunity to critically analyze texts that are beyond secondary level under timed examination conditions. What this means is thus that A, this shows admissions tutors how well you can respond to challenges, which is sort of, I think, a wider general theme in the admissions process. And secondly, the Elat also gives admissions tutors a good approximation of where the candidate's intellectual capacities lie, and possibly how well they can do at university level. So, what scores should you thus be aiming to get? I think you should be aiming to get a Band 1 score, and according to the Elat marking rubric as well as the examination reports, a Band 1 score is a score that is within 24 to 30, in other words, 48 to 60 on the results sheet that you'll be getting. I specifically also think that candidates should be trying to gain a mark over 50, even though, according to the examination reports, all Band 1 candidates will basically be invited to interview, and even many Band 2 candidates will also be. The reason is statistical. If you look at the examination reports for either Oxbridge or Cambridge every year, they'll tell you that they accept around 200 students to read English. At the same time, if you look at the Elat reports, approximately 200 students gain over 50 marks in their Elat. So if you put 2 to 2 together, it kind of means that getting a 50 or above mark will be safe. Although, and this is very important, the Elat, as with every other part of your admissions process, is not the be-all and the end-all. It's only one of many, many things that admissions tutors use to deem whether you're suitable to study at Oxford or Cambridge. So don't worry too much about it, but do keep that 50 mark in mind. With the format and the scoring of the Elat out of the way then, let us now look at an actual past paper and see how we might approach it. The paper I have chosen today is the 2016 paper for no reason except for the fact that it prints most of its passages. In fact, 5 out of 6 of the passages are printed, with the exception of the extract from Giovanni's room, which can be easily found online. And I have printed it here, as you can see. The reason I think it's important to find papers which have most of their passages is because I don't think that you should be forcing comparisons. Some texts simply just don't work with each other, and you don't want to have the illusion that all texts must in some way be able to be paired with each other. Now, let's look at the instructions and see what important things they tell us. What's most important, I think, is the notion that you cannot be allowed any extra paper. This means that the 8-page answer booklet is the only thing that you'll have. Firstly, you must therefore plan the length of your answer. You cannot go over 8 pages. And the best way to be able to do that, to be able to know how much you should be writing, is to practice. Secondly, it also means that you need to think whether or not you have space for rough notes and plans. There is no evidence that such notes will make a difference in the occasion that you cannot finish the essay. This also means that you will have to think whether or not it's a good idea to skip lines, because of course skipping lines will make your answer look clearer, especially if you have poor handwriting, but at the same time you only have 8 pages and there are not a lot of lines in that answer booklet anyways. And I would also be very wary of writing an incomplete essay. It would be much better if you wrote an essay that didn't have a lot of paragraphs, so it was at least complete, because completeness simply makes your essay so much better. It will make your essay score much better. Then the Elat tells you that you should allow at least 30 minutes reading this question paper, making notes, preparing your answer. I know a lot of people advise you to make full use of that 30 minutes, and that's a good idea, I think. I personally didn't do so because I personally thought I had a longer answer to write, and thus I took around 15 to 20 minutes. I would think 15 to 20 minutes is a bit fair because you do want to be able to make more points in your essay. Again, I think this is something that you should consider through practice. And finally, each text is given an alphabet. And I would suggest that you refer to these texts as text A, text B, text C, text D, text E, and text F, instead of a really clunky description such as, the extract from The Storm by John Donne, for instance. It's much easier that way, and it's much clearer to the examiner as well. Now, the first thing you should do after you're allowed to start the exam, of course, is to do a first reading and scanning of all the texts there are. And what do you want to accomplish in this process? Well, 2 things. Firstly, you'd want to get the gist of the text. And secondly, you'd want to be able to zoom in onto 2 or 3 texts that you think would be good to compare. And this is what I'm going to be doing now. Please feel free to pause before I discuss each text to read it first. Feel free also to compare what you think of the text with what I'm saying about the text. I think it's a good idea to engage in a sort of intellectual dialect to, again, further sort of hone your critical reading abilities. So the first text we have here is an extract from a poem by John Donne, an early modern poet from 1633. As I've said, the Elat papers sort of range very broadly chronologically, and you will most definitely be getting at least one early modern poet. I personally do not really like writing on these poems because not only is the language unfamiliar, but potentially there are also different ways of reading these texts that might be quite obscure and unknown to people who have been mostly working on sort of post-romantic literature at secondary school. I would say you might want to consider whether or not to write on these texts if you've never encountered them in school. So basically, a quick scan will tell me that, like Two Mighty Kings, I see here there's sort of a description of sort of how tempestuous and terrible the storm is. And then there's this idea of how, when I waked, I saw nothing. I and the sun should teach me, had forgot. And so he moves on to how the storm blurs his vision. And then we see some mention of the people and how the people are, how the sailors are, how seasick they are, etc., etc., etc. And finally, we turn to the ship itself. So basically, a portrait of the storm. Points of interest, one thing that caught my attention was the idea of Christianity here, of the mention of Jonas, who we know was sort of thrown into a storm situation and he had to trust God and so on. But of course, it's interesting here, this mention of Jonas, because in Jonas' story, we have the Christian association of storms as the sort of turbulences in life that God will bring us through. But of course, here, interestingly, we see no mention of that. The storm doesn't cease. It's powerful throughout, and there isn't sort of divine presence, even though the story of Jonas is invoked. The storm is incessantly powerful here, and no salvation seems to be present. Moving on then to Modern Painters by John Ruskin. When I saw this, the immediate thing that struck me was that, of course, this description of a painting. In other words, we have these sort of multiple modes of mediation here. It's a storm that is painted, and it's a painting that's being described. So it shows us that, these texts might also be linked with the idea of the representation of storms. These texts might be exploring and thinking about the very idea of the representation of nature. And then I look at it and everything looks sort of very, very poetic here. But, it's a lot of poetic diction, but I don't think it's aesthetically very interesting at this point for me. Although it's very interesting that we have mentioned this focus on the slave ship. Especially interesting because we then recall how the last line of text A sort of alludes to slave as from one hanged in chains a year ago. Who are we talking about? And then this focus on slavery seems to be highlighted to me through the way that, another text has this sort of emphasis. And it makes me think, well, especially since also the ship is described as guilty. And putting two together, this seems to me then perhaps to be a piece whose description of the storm imposes a moral judgment, almost as if, the guilty ship is getting what it deserves in the form of the storm. And certainly much of the imagery feels like it's from the biblical book of Revelation. For instance, things like glory as, bathes like blood, etc., etc., etc. So again, possibly something Christian. And at this point, I might sort of conclude by thinking that this might be a good pair with text A. So I might write down in my notes, perhaps A and B, Christianity, slavery, divinity. But moving on then, because it's important to consider everything, to not jump to conclusions, because there might be things that just surprise you. Moving on to text C then, what we have very clearly here, the portrait of a character, M, who is going through a storm. One of the things I noticed in a quick scan, there are these sort of authentic localisms. No idea what I would make of them, but certainly they're interesting. And very interesting again, of course, that there's the use of song here. The song is what helps M through the storm. It's interesting, of course, because this is a work of prose fiction, as we're told it's a novel. And thus there's this sort of formal clash here. It's also interesting that a particular piece of art is being used here to combat nature. So are we having this sort of art versus nature dyad here? Or alternatively, is it sort of the calmness and tranquility of M who brings her through the storm? So dyad is not sort of art versus nature, and it's instead inner psychology versus outer environment. I'm not sure, but I might want to sort of note that down. Or perhaps it might be both. Moving on then to D. First then, this is a dramatic text, so I would, if I want to write on it, be making notes on performance conventions. Broadly speaking, this is a bit of a difference from the theme of storm, because we don't really see a big description of a storm, although we have here this idea of you can hear the surface in the east and the surface in the west. Sort of again makes me think of text A when Donne describes the waves as being these three kings which are all coming together. So perhaps there are these references here, but I think mostly this extract is about a man who has died in a storm, and so in a way we're seeing instead the power and aftermath of storms. Staging wise, you have this idea of praying, almost funerary rites, and indeed it's also quite interesting the idea of perspective here, because it's the only text feature of community. In almost all the other texts we only have solitary focus on sort of individual characters, whereas here we have a community of people that's established through the characters being on the stage, their embodied presences. So that might be important. I don't know, I might think about that. So community, embodied selves and presences. Moving on to E, the storm. Again, we see a character, they're going through a storm. So already I'm seeing connections with C. And then the writing feels a bit simplistic though, so that might deter me from that because there's not a lot of aesthetic stuff there perhaps, but I'll continue going on. There's also a very, very strange incident here that for some reason after the speaker says, well, kill me, I cried and ran out into the open, suddenly the storm ceased. Well, this is not natural, this is very strange. Maybe perhaps again something psychological is going on. Certainly after a psychological change in the speaker, the sort of outer storm suddenly ceases. So again, we have this idea perhaps of inner psychology versus outer environment. This becomes a very good fit with C, I think. And finally, just to look briefly at the extract from Giovanni's room text, F. Well, here, this one is perhaps the most psychological of all. Again, perhaps gives me a bit of confidence to be talking about psychology here, because clearly psychology is what the examiners might have been thinking of when they were setting the paper. Because here, there's a literal storm that's going on. All we're seeing really is an internal storm, which had burst in me like a storm. So again, this makes it a very good fit with C and E. And so here I have basic two groups. So A and B with their idea of archaic, sort of Christian, biblical, gnomic depiction of a storm versus C, E, and F with their sort of more psychological approaches to a storm. As I said before, I don't really like working on early modern texts, simply because I find that they're quite difficult to go through and that there's a lot in them to go through. And I'm afraid I might trip over the language as unfamiliar to me. I'd like to focus on the more contemporary works, the sort of more modern. And so I'm left with C, E, and F. And among them, I don't really like F that much because I don't think there's a lot to say about the storm because most of it simply isn't about a storm. And so I finally ended up with C and E. With my choices made, then I can now move on to look closely, annotate the text that I have chosen. And now here, of course, perhaps the most important question in Elat paper, what should you be looking for in a close reading? Of course, no one single answer. What I'll be doing now is simply just only my own approach. And indeed, I think one of the very important things to be doing when we prepare for the Elat is to seek out different close reading methods, different approaches. And to do that, I've compiled a short reading list so on our website, which again, the link is in the description box below. But generally, certainly, of course, you can focus on such things as structure and language and imagery. But there are more minute and interesting aspects that you can focus on, which I'll try to demonstrate now. Also, it's very important to focus on the formal importances. So don't try to treat a piece of poetry and a piece of prose as if they were the same thing. Without further ado, starting with text C. Now, the first thing I noticed in text C is that, of course, we have this description of the storm in paragraph 2. And of course, one might notice that there's a personification of the way, the wind howled around the chimneys and uttered a long, low cry. Well, I put that down, but it doesn't seem very important to me at this point. Because, what's there to say except for the fact that, the storm is made human. There's nothing sort of aesthetically very powerful to say yet, I think. More interesting for me is, for instance, the adjective weird here. It might seem like a small thing, but for those of you who read Macbeth and have known about the weird sisters, they know that the old word weird stems from the Old English word weird, which sort of means fate, sort of, divine forces, these forces that are beyond human control. Is the wind here some sort of divine fatalistic force of destruction? Certainly the power of the wind is ascertained by the way, for instance, that it takes the last word in this text. In here, while the wind hurled down a row of bricks from the gable and made the walls tremble. And it's also quite interesting, isn't it, that here we have sort of a third person narrative and the rest of the extract focuses on M. But towards the end, all of a sudden, we hear back again how while the wind hurled down a row of bricks from the gable and made the walls tremble, it's almost as if the narrative attention cannot help but be repeatedly drawn to the power of the wind. The wind is so powerful that it repeatedly captures narrative attention. And then if I think a bit more about the issue of personification, I seem to have more ideas now. Personification here seems almost to contrast natural power with human insignificance. How so? For instance, we see that the night wind howled round, whereas the humans, all they can do is simply whisper to one another. And of course, we also more generally, through the personification, we see the idea of sound being stressed. Not only, we have the sound of the wind howling and screaming, and not only we have the humans whispering, we also have the beams of the wagon house creaking and groaning. Again, personification, again, emphasizing the sound. The soundscape of the storm, in other words, is one of cacophony. But though the wind appears extremely powerful, it might be said that much of the extract focuses on M, who is able to counter the storm. And indeed, one way of doing so, as I mentioned in my brief reading just then, is perhaps this idea of her psychological tranquility. And how do we see this tranquility manifested and sort of expressed? Well, for instance, one of the ways we might talk about is the sort of abundance of verbs here. She lighted the fire and sat on the ground, doing this, doing that. There's sort of a logical procession of verbs here that sort of seems calm and sort of almost rhythmical. Books of prose do have their own rhythms here, and here we have very steady sort of onslaught of verbs appearing in the beginning of clauses. She lighted a fire and sat on the ground, turning the roaster cakes. Perhaps you may also want to be talking about the way the images in paragraph 3 here of fire burning up steadily, casting its amber glow over M's light hair and black dress. You have this sort of imagery of light. Again, might be a bit rudimentary compared to sort of more linguistic analysis, more tactical analysis I showed just then with the idea of the verbs processing. But again, it's something that you might want to be mentioning. But of course, to me, as I pointed out when I was first reading it, the most interesting thing here is that there is also this aesthetic, this artistic countering of the storm. And how does that manifest? Well, it manifests through the song that M sings. And on one simple level, what the song does is that it provides a melodious sound that opposes the cacophonous soundscape of the storm. So here you're also making use of sort of structural contrast here through a sort of more conceptual and thematic lens. And why exactly will I say this is melodious sound? Well, I can't just say that, right? Well, I must be able to sort of substantiate my ideas. Well, for instance, one of the things you might want to mention is the idea of sibilance. We have the S sound that's being emphasized. There's also sort of alliteration of the W sound. All of these are sort of soft sounds, sort of round edges, soft sounds that allude to ideas of softness and sort of whispers that, again, sort of is melodious and tranquil and calm and good to the ear. Also, perhaps there's this idea of a sense of stability here in the song. In terms of its structure, for instance, you have the anaphoric where. You also have the idea of the refrain. You have a very stable rhyme scheme here. You have ABAB rhyme scheme. And you also have sort of individual repetitions such as dead, dead, dead. And all of this creates a sense of stability that, again, contrasts with the harshness and the destruction of the storm. I think that might be a significant enough close reading at this point. I'm trying to illustrate the idea is that there are sort of more interesting things to focus on instead of the things that all candidates do, things like narrative perspective and so on. Not to say that these things aren't important, but there are also things such as sound, such as, the use of individual words, the idea of tranquility, the idea of sort of meta artistic elements, such as, how art is being used to counter a particular thing. So one of the most important tips I have for the Elat is that when you close read things, consider more conceptual, consider more sort of nuanced conceptual aspects, such as the things here, but then substantiate them with very precise individual details on the language, on the sort of other literary devices here. Mix these two things together, mix the thematic with the artistic and the literary. And I think you'll do very, very well. Finally, another point to make is that I might want to make a point about this emphasis on character, because after all, this is an novel, and as we know, works of prose fiction sort of place a lot of heavy emphasis on the issue of character. Moving on now to text E. Well, once again, I think we have this description of the storm and its destructiveness, its power. Though, of course, it's interesting, the descriptions seem a bit rudimentary and sort of childish. For those who do know Catherine Mansfield, you'll know that this is part of her juvenilia, but of course, you're not expected to know this. Instead, perhaps simply plow on and see if there's sort of anything interesting that you might be able to make out of this. Well, for instance, despite having said how sort of quite juvenile this writing seems to be, we might comment, for instance, on the phrase "the ends of the earth." Well, it's a curious phrase because it sounds extremely gnomic in that it sounds sort of quite biblical. And in fact, it sounds, again, like sort of Book of Revelation. And how do I know this? Well, I know this because we've talked about this when we looked at text day. So this is another reason why it's so important for you to really consider all the texts, because they sort of feed onto each other, and sort of by thinking about one, you start to notice sort of other details in the others that you might not on a first glance be privy to. So again, sort of more apocalyptic imagery, if you like, and you can see all this continuously. And indeed, then I think it's also important to try to make sense of this as a comparison, because after all, when you're annotating, I think it's important that you always compare. Well, it seems to me that this idea, this sort of perhaps this invocation of the divine, ties in with C's use of the word weird here. Again, some sort of idea of some form of perhaps divinity, some sort of non-human force here, perhaps. Though, of course, unlike text B, text D here doesn't have the sort of moral judgment that text B applies onto the slave ship. Another very interesting thing to me is a line here of how the force is lashed together, and the sort of the tree crowns appear to be a huge wave thundering and bursting over my head. Well, what I think is interesting in this line, firstly, is the idea of synesthesia. What is synesthesia? It simply is sort of a technique where multiple senses are evoked and engaged with in a particular line of description. It's quite interesting in the way that sort of multiple senses are engaged. Sort of the reading experience becomes something that's sort of sensorially multiple. The reader is really sort of put into this experience of the storm by having their senses engaged. You have the visual, you have the sonic of bursting, and you also have that feeling. At the same time, also, it's not only synesthetic, but there's also the idea of perhaps of things being distorted by the storm. There's sort of the idea of distortion, that the storm is distorting. It sort of has a very powerful destructive power. Finally, if we look a bit at form, because I said that form is important, we might comment on how sort of irregular free verse here that's used. There's sort of an irregularity here. The rhyme is irregular, the line lengths are irregular. And that sort of irregularity seems to be part of this scattering, this sort of destruction that the storm brings. So in other words, form here mimics content, acknowledging the fact that form matters. It shows the examiner that you're not simply treating text D as the same thing as text, because evidently they're not. A poem works differently as work of prose does, and you should be aware and sensitive to these formal differences. Again, I think we have this idea of psychology, don't we? Because the speaker evidently psychologically counters the storm.
How? Well, I think we might want to think a bit more deeply about, well, why the storm ceases. It's interesting how, the storm runs wild when the speaker is afraid, when she wants to be protected. I'm a lost child. And then afterwards, when she becomes brave, when she sort of asserts herself, when she faces the storm, then all of a sudden the storm ceases. So the storm seems to be sort of a psychological manifestation of perhaps her insecurities. And once she has braved those insecurities, the storm ceases. Now, at this point, we've made a quite sophisticated thematic analysis, but if you stop there and simply content with sort of content being summarized content saying, oh, there's this change, then the examiners won't be as happy with you because this sort of a close reading, yes, it is a form of close reading, but it's in a very interesting one because you're sort of only paraphrasing content. What you want to do is also then to see how sort of individual stylistic and literary details will support the sort of more thematic conceptual point you have. And so one of the things I noticed is that this might be enacted metrically as well. Again, what do I mean by this? Well, I'm noticing where the position of the I is. Now, if you read the first few lines, you'll see that they're roughly in iambic pentameter. I ran to the forest for shelter, breathless, half sobbing. I put my arms around a tree. Again and again, the I seems to be in an unstressed position. So before the braving of insecurities, the I is unstressed, mimicking how perhaps the I is sort of submerged within insecurities. But here, when he goes, then for what reason I know not, for what reason the Sun here is unstressed, and so therefore here it's stressed. I know not is unstressed, and I become stressed here again. Will kill me, I cried. And here suddenly, at this point, for what reason I know not, I became triumphant. The I takes on a stress position after becoming brave. So metrically, we have the change in stress with the first person pronoun I enacts this sort of psychological change. It sort of emphasizes how the I personhood is being emphasized and how this then counters the storm. This then will cause your answer to become much more sophisticated and much more focused on literary technique. Finally, because there's also the idea of sort of an aesthetic counter of the storm in text C, I also want to think about whether that's present in text E. And I thought a bit about that and I thought, wow, perhaps this actually ties into what I was saying just then about how rudimentary and juvenile the poem is. Because one of the ways this sort of juvenility is registered is the way that the poem is, it seems like some sort of a childhood story, doesn't it? I did this, but this happened, and sort of but it was shown, oh, my dreams are thwarted, and so on and so forth. And then finally I said, why kill me, but the storm ceased, and everything ended happily ever after. There's this rigid imposition of narrative logic here. Bad, and then after I braved a particular difficulty, everything worked out for me. It follows a sort of fairy tale like progression that is tactically enacted with the sort of buts there, as well as the way the plot is structured. Of course, we know this doesn't happen, right? The storm doesn't just cease like that. Like nothing, storms never just cease in that same way. It's not like in a story where these things happen. And so here, perhaps, what's interesting is that we also have an aesthetic controlling of the storm. It's being subsumed within a narrative fairy tale logic. And so we also have an aesthetic countering of the storm here, an aesthetic countering of nature here. Now, by this point, then, and according to this table, I think we just have a very neat argument that can be formed. Now, of course, in the actual thing, you probably won't be able to form such a very neat table that quickly, because after all, I did this because I had prepared and I had thought about these texts in advance. But nonetheless, you would want to be doing something like this. And now the final part of this process is that you want to be forming an argument. And that is the second most important thing about the Elat. And that is, what is an argument? What is your essay supposed to do? Well, an argument in the Elat is basically an interpretation of these two texts that A, develops in a number of steps, and B, has to be illustrated through comparative close reading. And so what would be the argument that I build given these two texts? Well, I'd say something like that both texts depict the might of a storm here, but ultimately also depict its being countered and controlled through a character's mind. In other words, M's tranquility shown through the images of light, and as well as shown as a logical possession of verbs, and as well as metatextually through artistic means. Though both texts exemplify similar trajectories, I would say, they differ in the character psychologies as well as the art forms they use to counter a storm. So character psychologies, we have a tranquil character here. M is being sort of passively wearing the storm, as it were. Whereas here there's a sort of essence of active change. The speaker has to change, he has to become brave. At the same time, they also differ in the art forms they use to counter the storm. In fact, they seem to use each other's forms. So the work of prose fiction uses a song, uses a poetic song to counter the storm, Whereas in text E, the poem uses narrative as a form of controlling nature, as a form of controlling the storm. How is this then a good argument, or at least what I would think is a good argument? A, I have given a line of interpretation that goes, so they're depicting two different things, they're depicting the might of a storm, but also a storm being countered. At the same time, this is a thing that develops in multiple aspects. So, I go from the might of a storm to it's being countered, and I go from two different ways of it being countered, psychologically, as well as metatextually through artistic means. B, I have given both similarities and differences, and I have made these similarities and differences central to my introductory paragraph, central to my introduction, central to my thesis. And finally, I have focused on conventional things, such as the language and narrative, but I've also considered, more nuanced things, syntax, how verbs are possessed, meter, and so on and so forth. A combination of the more conventional aspects within a sort of more conceptual and sort of more sophisticated framework would give, I think, a pretty good answer. Now, of course, I have no way of telling you how an answer of this sort might score. And perhaps you may disagree with some of my own readings, or perhaps, even with this sort of table, there's still a lot of things I need to flesh out during the writing process. But for me, at least, I personally quite like what I've produced. And I think at the end of the day, if you leave the exam hall feeling like you've had something great to say about your texts, then you should give yourself a great big pat on the back.
I'd like to end with a brief note on practicing. Now, earlier I said that it's a good idea to practice to know, for instance, how much time you would need and sort of length of essay you can produce within sort of 1 hour or 1 hour and 15 minutes. However, I don't think that you should continuously practice over and over and over and over again, aiming, for instance, to finish all the past papers that are available. This is because the Elat, I think, as with all forms of close reading, requires you to use your imaginative and creative faculties. And these things can become stale if you continuously over-practice. So, as a final note, I think it's a good idea to do 1 or 2 past papers, but beyond that, I think it's a better idea to simply write essay plans, to continue looking at texts, continue exploring the potentials, continue reading up on different close reading materials, continue exploring the things that you're interested in. Galvanize your brain, I think, galvanize your critical mind before the Elat, and enter really the exam hall that day with a fresh mind that's truly interested in what you have to say. And then after that, try and enjoy the process and ultimately leave the exam hall knowing that however you've already done a really good job, and that you should be really proud of yourself for having come so far. All the very best to everybody who's taking the Elat soon, and good luck. I hope this video has been helpful.